Hello and welcome to week 5 of HSVC 495. And today we're going to talk a little bit about effective presentation skills. And these are skills that you will be applying when you do your presentations for your fellow classmates in week 9. The other topic from this week, which you have some videos to view, is about developing effective slide presentations. So these two kind of go together. One is how to develop slides that will work in your presentation, and the other is about how to present that presentation to others. So we hope that by the end of this session you'll be able to list the key steps in preparing for a presentation, identify important steps in facilitating discussion during a presentation, and then in week 9 you'll be able to demonstrate how to give an interactive presentation with your fellow students. So what are some of the kinds of presentations we give in the Human Services? These are just a few examples. In the clinical realm, we participate in both case consultations, where we're consulting with other professionals about the case, and case presentations, where we're presenting the case to others, which is what you all will be doing in week 9. We sometimes are part of family conferences where we're presenting about a client. We give workshops or do teaching as human service professionals. We might run an educational group for clients or run a community meeting. In the administrative realm, we may be in charge of organizing and facilitating staff meetings, doing professional development sessions for our coworkers, or presenting to funders or regulatory agencies about our work. So you will probably have other examples of presentations that you do or that are done in your agency, but this is just a few examples. So it's important to be able to do an effective presentation because our professional work will demand it of us. So first, we need to plan our sessions. So very important to get an understanding of who is in your audience before giving a presentation. For example, we're putting on a continuing education workshop here at City University next week, and we want to understand a little bit about our audience. So on the registration form, we asked a few questions to determine where people worked, what their experience was in the topic, and what their interest in the workshop was. So before we do the workshop, we're going to look at all that information so we can make sure that we gear the workshop to the level of expertise of our audience and to what their goals are for attending the workshop. And then as you're planning a presentation, you want to know what do you want the participants to learn. And from that, you should be making learning objectives or goals that will guide the development of the presentation. So for example, from this session today, I developed these learning objectives. This is what I want you to learn or be able to do at the end of today's session. And so I tried to develop all the information and slides based on meeting these learning goals. Then, as you're planning and preparing for your session, you need to make sure you know the content well and that you're prepared to answer questions about the content. You should think about what sort of visual aids will you use. Will you use PowerPoint? Will you use a flip chart or a whiteboard? Will you show a video? What will you use to help get the information across? And then very important, what examples or stories can you use to illustrate the information? And as you're putting your presentation together, you want to organize it in a particular way. You're going to start with an introduction of yourself in the presentation, present the objectives, and then keep focused on just a few main points. You really don't want more than 2 or 3 or 4 at the most main points for your presentation. Any more than that, and people will get a little bit overwhelmed and confused about what your presentation is about. And then you want to present the ideas sequentially or in a way that builds upon them, so that they build upon each other. From the most simple to the most complex is a good way to go about it. You want to use good organizational skills to keep your presentation on track, both in terms of content and in terms of time. And when you're finished, you want to summarize the key points of your presentation and then allow time for people to ask questions. You can also have people ask questions throughout your presentation, but you want to also make sure that at the end that there's some specific time for dialogue with the audience. As your presenter, you want to use both good verbal and nonverbal communication skills. So your voice should be loud. If you're in the classroom with people, it should be loud enough that the person in the back row can hear you. If you're doing an electronic presentation like this one, you want to check the volume controls to make sure that it's clear and loud enough. As you're talking, you should not be talking in a monotone. You should have a lot of variation in your tone and in the pitch of your presentation. You should be expressive, and you want to use your voice to emphasize your points or ideas. Once again, if you're in person with the class or in a session like Collaborate, you want to use eye contact. You want to be able to look at your participants and look around the room and make eye contact with several people in different points of the room. And that means that you need to know your material well enough and have practiced your material so that you're not looking at your slides or your notes the whole time, that you're looking at the audience. You should also be using varied and appropriate facial expressions and gestures, and not just standing in front of the room like a robot. Again, if you're in the classroom, it's nice to move around the room a little bit to engage participants, but not pacing back and forth nervously or running back and forth, but just moving naturally, coming closer to participants, moving away from participants, etc. And your enthusiasm will be infectious. So if you're enthusiastic about your topic and you're an enthusiastic presenter, that will make your participants also feel enthusiastic about what you're talking about. It's important to be able to manage your audience. One thing that's really great to be able to do is to use names when addressing participants. Now that can be really hard in a large group of people. Sometimes presenters ask people to wear name tags, or they have a little name tent in front of them on the table. If you have a small enough group, it's important to try and learn people's names. And you want to use questions very effectively in your presentation. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. When participants are speaking or asking questions, you want to be respectful and listen closely. Don't interrupt them unless they're going on for too long or getting off topic. You want to relate the content of your presentation to the experience of participants. Generally, you will have in the professional presentations participants who have experience in the content area. So you want to be able to use the experience of the audience. And also try to encourage participation from your audience. This will just make it so much more engaging for everybody and so much more interesting if you get to hear about the experiences of participants. And be culturally sensitive. This means knowing, again, your audience and their context so that when you're speaking, you're being able to relate to them, and also not, I think also in terms of participation, being culturally sensitive. If you're, for example, conducting a community meeting, and in this community it's very important that the elders are respected and the ones who speak first, then you should make sure when you're having audience participation that you're calling on the elders of the community first to give their feedback or comments. So that's an example of being culturally sensitive as you're giving a presentation. So here is a scenario that is pretty common, unfortunately, as a presenter. You started your presentation a half hour ago and the participants are still very quiet. No one responds when you ask a question. There's dead silence in the room. What would you do to stimulate discussion in this scenario? Now, I know you can't answer this question because we're not talking in real time, but I want you just to think about this for a second. What would you do if everyone is quiet when you're talking? So here are some possible responses. You might rephrase the question. Maybe they didn't understand your question. Or you might ask a different question. If no one answers your question, you may ask people to break up in pairs and talk about the question between themselves and then come back to you with the answer. This is a great way to encourage participation. You might, try to find out why no one is talking. Do they not understand what you're talking about? Are they bored? Are they tired? Are they hungry? Is it you or is it them? Find out why. If people look tired or it's, right after lunch or late in the afternoon, you might do some kind of energizer or some kind of participatory activity to wake people up and get them engaged again in the presentation. So these are just a few ideas of how to encourage participation. And you probably have some ideas of your own. So one of the very important tools for making a presentation interactive and engaging is to make sure that there's a lot of questions going on, that you're asking questions and answering questions. This allows for a lot of interchange between participants and presenters and among participants. Questions are used to focus attention on key points, to involve participants in the learning, to provoke thought, to clarify ideas, and sometimes to determine what participants already know so that you're not repeating things that they already know or not making the presentation too basic. So when asking questions, you want to be clear. You want to ask questions that are easy to understand in plain language. You want your questions to be brief. They should be phrased succinctly and precisely. And don't ask multi-part questions. Don't ask 3 questions at once. You want to figure out why you're asking the question. Is it to see if the participants understood, to see if we're on the right track, to generate discussion, to review what you've talked about or what participants have already learned? Be sure you know about the purpose of questions. And when you're giving a presentation, usually professionals, you're not really trying to test participants or highlight their deficits of knowledge. You don't want to really put people on the spot by asking something they don't know the answer to or embarrassing people. So you want to really be clear about why you're asking questions of the participants. And in general, you want to direct your questions to the whole audience and not just call out a particular participant, unless you know that maybe that person has some particular expertise to share or some experience that they could lend when they answer the question. So those are some guidelines for asking questions of your audience. And now here are some guidelines for answering audience questions. First, you want to encourage participants to ask questions. Invite them to ask questions throughout the presentation. And after you've talked about a particular topic, you might just say, what are your questions about this topic? As opposed to saying, are there any questions? When someone asks you a question, you first want to repeat back the question so the whole audience can hear it. And then don't always respond to the question. Sometimes you can actually redirect the question back to the participant or to the group. This will help to encourage more discussion. In addition, you should treat all questions with respect. There's no such thing as a bad or stupid question. Do not be judgmental, either verbally or non-verbally, when someone asks a question. And even if the question seems off-topic or irrelevant, you should respond to it in some way, even to say, this isn't quite related to our topic. Thanks for your question, and maybe we'll get to that topic a little bit later. Or you could say, come up and talk to me about that question after the presentation. And as you're giving a presentation, particularly if you're in the same room with people, you should be looking at people's faces to see if they look confused or curious. So you're looking for nonverbal signs that people have a question. And then you might say, it looks like you're not quite following this, or it looks like you might have a question. Is there anything you'd like to ask about this topic? So sometimes when you're giving a presentation, someone asks you a question and you don't know the answer to their question. So what do you do or say in that situation? Well, there are several things you could do. You could say, I'm not sure about the answer, but maybe someone in the audience knows the answer. And again, direct it back to see if there's any expertise in the audience that can help. You may refer to a resource that you have on hand. You might say, let's look at the DSM-5 and see what it says, or whatever other resource is relevant. If no one in the audience knows the answer, and you don't have a resource on hand to give you the answer, then you might say, good question, let me check on that and I'll get back to you tomorrow, or after the break, or after lunch. And then you need to make sure that you do get back to people. Now, as I mentioned before, it's really important to develop some good stories or examples when you're giving a presentation. This might be a case example with clients about a particular issue. And if so, it shouldn't be like a unique case that your audience is never likely to see or hear of again. It should be something somewhat typical of what people will be seeing in a human services setting so that they can relate to it. You should also ask the audience if they have some examples or stories to tell about your topic. Your examples should create a picture for the participants of the situation, or help them to think about how they might apply the information in their setting. It should be brief and clear. So these real-life relevant examples are really important when you're giving a presentation. When you conclude, you should summarize the main points, invite or encourage people to act, and tell them how they might want to put what they've learned into practice. Suggest how they can learn more about the topic, and ask participants if they have any ideas of how they can learn more or how they can apply the information. And a good presenter tries to end on time to respect the audience's time and participation. So what do you think is the most important thing you can do to be an effective presenter? I would say that one of the most important things that you can do, or maybe two I should say, is to practice your presentation and prepare. Before you even step into the room, the things that you can do to make sure your presentation is a success is to prepare. So the examples of that are knowing your audience, making sure you understand the technology, that the room is set up the way you want, that you've developed a really nice presentation. And then you should have practiced your presentation. I think a good rule of thumb is to practice it at least 3 times. I like to practice in front of the mirror and just practice out loud, not just in my head, because the way things sound in your head and the way things sound when you're speaking is very different. And sometimes things sound really awkward that you think were going to sound really good. So if you practice out loud several times, your presentation will flow smoothly when you actually are giving it. So just a couple of key things to remember about giving an effective presentation. Both verbal and nonverbal communication tools can help you to engage participants in a more meaningful presentation. And the delivery of your presentation is at least as important as your knowledge of the content. You should facilitate participation engagement through questions and answers, through large group discussions, and through breaking up people into small groups and giving them activities or ways to apply the knowledge. And utilizing the experience and expertise of your audience will definitely make a more meaningful presentation for everybody.